If 1964 was the year of the Beatles, when they meant all things to all peoples, then 1965 was the year that the Stones shifted gear, even though some folks thought they were evil. Newsflash people, it is January 10, 1965, and the scene couldn't be groovier. This chart is fantastic, it's out of control, it is upset in every way. Let's get down to it. Kicking off the week with our usual disclaimer, do not try this at home, this is not legal advice, and read a product description and liability statement before use. Hello and goodbye! Departing the top 10 this week, we have a former single-week number one, sick and tired by the man I think is the greatest Australian rocker ever, Billy Thorpe. Get used to that phrase, single-week number one. We're on an incredible streak of single-use chart toppers, going back to the 15th of November when She's a Mod by Ray Columbus and the Invaders spent the last of its 3 weeks on top, whereafter we have the Kinks, Jay and the Americans, Gail Garnett, Elvis Presley, Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs, the Searchers, the Beatles, and this week's number one, which were all one-and-done ultimates. It wasn't until next week when the number one stuck around for 2 weeks and the streak broke. Sick and Tired is a great record from Albert Studios. Albert Records didn't come about until the end of the decade, with Ted Albert uncredited here at the desk. It spent the week before Christmas on top and fell to number 12 this week. Curiously, Billy's Over the Rainbow pulled up ahead of it to number 11. And guess where that was going? Yep, right to the top for more than just a week. Replacing it in the 10 was the wonderful Come See About Me by the Supremes, which hovered for 3 weeks or so in the 10 and reached number 5. But gee, when you try to contemplate the imponderable that is what is the Supremes' best single, this one really needs to be prominent in that conversation. This needs to be prominent in the conversation for what were the best records ever made on Motown. Biggest hit leaving the charts this week was Jan and Dean's Ride the Wild Surf, which reached number 8 and did 11 weeks in. Biggest hit joining, in a week of not very big hits joining, was the Rolling Stones 5x5 EP, which featured Around and Around as a listed hit, which only lasted 6 weeks but shot up to number 6 in that mere time. And the next number one was the frankly finger-licking good Repackaged Hen by Nelson Shin. I have no clue. The terrific 10 this week were those very Rolling Stones you've all heard of, before they became a desiccated parody, with Time Is On My Side leaving the charts after a run that took it to number 4. One of their better early hits, they found this as an Irma Thomas B-side. Thomas was so upset at the lack of any recognition the Stones afforded her after making a hit of it, she refused to sing it for many, many years, and it wasn't until she performed it as a duet with Jagger at a show in 2024 that the hatchet was finally buried. Number 9 is Brill-building voice savant Gene Pitney, having a hit here with a Barryman Cynthia Weil song, I'm Gonna Be Strong. Pitney was more accustomed to writing the hits for others, but he managed 22 top 40 singles himself. The biggest was 1976's Blue Angel, which hit number 1. Dropping down to 9 after 3 weeks at 7, this did 13 weeks, and Pitney would be back stronger than ever later in the year. 8 are the Flowers of 2628 West Grand Boulevard, the Supremes, with Come See About Me, the third of their run of 5 straight US number ones. Written, as all of their great hits were, by Brian and Lamont Dozier and Eddie Holland. In an odd twist, this got to number 5 here, but stiffed so badly in the southern capitals that it only made number 78 nationally. In the US, it made number 1 in early December for a week, but got knocked off by the Beatles with I Feel Fine, and then came back to the top in January. It's a harrowingly sad song, despite the bump and stomp that drummer Uriel Jones and Mike Valvado give it, and certainly I think one of the very greatest Motown singles. We never really rated Motown here in Australia in the 60s, though, so underperformance like this one is all too common. In at 7, another OWNO, Oh No, a 1 week number 1, with that band from Liverpool that we all loved in the 60s, The Searchers, with When You Walk in the Room. All jangly and lovely, this one replaced Sick and Tired at number 1 for the last week of December, and like a lot of top 10s in this era, didn't stick around once it had its peak. The 14 weeks it did spend on the charts was pretty good for this era. The Searchers got their start with Tony Hatch as their producer and songwriter, him from last week's episode, before they got hot with 2 Jackie DeShannon songs, Needles and Pins and this one. They jangled on in a similarly pleasant fashion until they just faded away by the end of 1966. Like so many 60s bands, the survivors carry on to this day in various fractured permutations, each carrying as much of the name as they legally can. Number 6 this week is one of my secret favourites of the 60s, the sassy Shangri-Las with their hopelessly kitsch leader of the pack. The four girls, two sets of sisters, including one of identical twins, were in high school when they signed for Redbird Records. They worked with George Morton, creating these little 2.5-minute sonic operas with Mary Weiss's keen, dramatic voice setting the scene, and the rest of the girls offering a Greek chorus which scolded, encouraged and mocked poor Mary through the songs. For all the great records they made, this was their only hit in Australia. The band, by the way, got their fantastic name from a restaurant their parents hung out at in Queens. At one point, on tour in the Midwest, their backup band was the Iguanas, featuring the future Iggy Pop on drums. Number 5 is Bobby Vinton with Mr. Lonely. Vinton was the kind of singer who was becoming redundant by 1965, but he'd been a chart regular before this with 8 top 40 hits. Vinton came from Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, which made him a bit of a big shot, I guess. Hitmakers of his calibre were hard to come by. Perry Como also came from Canonsburg, and Vinton can be seen as some kind of successor, but good as he might have been, he lacked Como's warmth and sincerity. These shortcomings notwithstanding, when you read in about him, Vinton has an unimpeachable reputation, it seems, as a nice guy and a genuinely decent man in an industry where very few people earn such accolades. This hopped up to number 3 next week, but it was just a rage against the dying of the light, as Vinton disappeared from the top 10 forever immediately thereafter. Time for the segment where we decry my friends and relatives for their lack of good taste in not sending these records to the top 10. Local record buyer is an idiot. And of the two most egregious omissions, the first is Sandy Shaw, whom we met last week as a chart-bestriding behemoth, here reduced to a tantalising failure of a number 11 top for Always Something There to Remind Me, which laboured 9 weeks for that disappointment. Equally meritorious as a record, if not as successful, the Beach Boys only managed number 27, with Dance, 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 Glenn Campbell's excellent 12-string riffage falling on apparently deaf ears. Philistines. Rocker Del Shannon, one of the best things about the pre-Beatles 60s, twangs and wibbles and wobbles his way up the chart at number 4 with Keep Searchin', another in his series of rather dark, paranoid-sounding hits. This one would ascend to the top spot next week, which would hold for a fortnight, after which it would drop from 1 to 10, a hefty plunge indeed. But it hung about 19 weeks on the charts was an epic run for these days. 14 local top 40 hits for Shannon, including a number 7 for what was the first US charting cover of a Lennon-McCartney song, From Me to You. One of the great mysteries of the universe remains why did Cliff Richard never become a superstar in the US? He was a solid rocker, a fine pop singer, he had a crackerjack band and he wasn't the worst looking fella ever. And a song like On the Beach, a twist-tastic summer slammer, should have shot up the charts. But no, he had 3 stinking top 10s in 60 years, and all of them in the late 70s. And the fact that neither he nor the Shadows are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is the most damning indictment I can think of for what John Lydon rightly called a piss stain. Anyway, On the Beach is a banger and it seems amazing in a period where everyone got a go at being number 1, it only got to number 2. It's from the movie Wonderful Life and it may come as a surprise to the less Cliff informed here. The Cliff is a better and a more natural actor than Elvis Presley. He should have made more films. 13 weeks in, top of 2, this is Top Draw Cliff. At 2, it's last week's number 1, I Feel Fine, as played on their authentic instruments by the actual Beatles themselves. One of their less remarkable singles, it relies largely on Ringo's drums, clearly modelled on Ray Charles's What I Say, to kick it along, and the riff bears a striking resemblance to Bobby Parker's Watch Your Step. The real question is, why did this spend but a single week on top? Well, the logical inference is that the B-side, She's a Woman, may have been the reported sale at some stores who entered stats for the top 40, but I can't see any evidence of that making any charts. And down south, it spent 6 weeks on top in Sydney and 4 in Melbourne. And there was no good reason that the song that knocked it off number 1 should have done so in any sort of hurry. It's a good record, but as you'll see, it hardly screams make me number 1. Bit of a mystery. I'd value your thoughts on the topic. While we're here, it's worth noting the B-side, She's a Woman, is a wonderful example of the central flaw of the Beatles, that the longer you spend staring at magic, the less magical it becomes. The longer you gaze on it, the huge flaws become apparent. The not especially in tune guitars, Lennon's numerous flubbed chops, Ringo is conspicuous by his absence, only popping out right at the end. McCartney seems to be more intent on the sound of his voice than his usually impeccable pitching of it. Given that it was recorded under tremendous pressure before the band had to go on tour, it's understandable, but it's not one of the more enlightened entries in their catalogue. The facts are here, and they are full, plump and pleasing. There are more plastic flamingos in the world than there are real ones. Leonardo is the most popular male baby name in Italy at the moment. Blue Monday by New Order is the biggest selling 12-inch single in history, but unbeknownst to the band they lost money on every copy of it they sold because the special cover it was issued in cost more to make than the royalty from the record. Outstanding facts there, but they pale to these because it's Val's fantastic world of fact. Biggest riser this week is the in-name only by now Drifters with Saturday Night at the Movies, written by the super team of Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, up from 30 to 15. The big tumbler was Sounds Incorporated's version of the William Tell Overture, down 7 spots to 32 after a top of number 3. Biggest debut in the week of not especially great debutantes is Mary Wells, she of the massive Motown hit My Guy, now on a new label, who came in at 37 with Ain't It the Truth, which only lasted another week on the charts. And the longest runner on the charts at a mere 11 weeks was the aforementioned William Tell Overture. In the USA this week it was the Supremes with their comeback number 1 Come See About Me, which was to stay atop this week before Petula Clark's Downtown dispatched it. In Petula's native UK, Georgie Fame, a really cool dude, had the first of his 3 number 1s with Yeah Yeah. This time last year it was I Wanna Hold Your Hand by the band that we came eventually to know as the Beatles, in the first of its 12 weeks on top, and a year from now it was those very same Beatles, or at least some Beatles very similar to those ones, who held the supremacy with Day Tripper. And the number 1 album this week, the first ever Australian number 1 album, was the Rolling Stones' self-titled debut, which if you ask me, I would say after not a great deal of thought, because I tend not to give a great deal of thought to these things, I would say it was my favourite Stones album, if not their best. 1965 was a great year for music and some very important artists released their debut albums. Guys like these.
Sky with faraway clouds just wandering by.
It's not unusual to be loved by anyone. It's not unusual to have fun.
From now on, all my friends are gonna be strangers.
I had $1 million or $2 in the bank. I gave to charity, ain't got no thanks.
Between sundown's finish and midnight's broken tone, I don't mind other guys dancing with my girl.
To drum us into number 1, it's the top-rated monkey drummer of all time on YouTube, Monty the Safety Monkey.
I am the little red rooster. Too late.
And the number 1 this week is those very self-same Rolling Stones with Little Red Rooster. Up last week from number 3 and falling to 9 next week, this is a great record per se, but I'm somewhat unconvinced as to its charms as a single. It has a remarkable guitar part for Brian Jones in it, and Jagger manages to make it sound, if not Howling Wolf menacing, at least uncomfortable, but it's just such an outlier for a number 1 single. It had a curious run up the charts, 32, 17, 9, 3, 1, and then it dropped violently next week, and after its 11-week run was done for shortly thereafter, making it one of the very shortest chart runs for number 1 hits that we will see. So not a likely number 1 hit single, but as this series unfolds, we'll see many number 1 hit singles that are much worse. So that was, in not so many words, how the cow ate the cabbage back in the new year of 1965. It has been lovely to chat with you, and do rest assured, should the good Lord be a-willing and the creeks don't rise, I'll be back again with another instalment next week. Ish.